One chemist in Arizona is rolling back the clock to figure out where the first spark of life came from. All living things on this planet have one thing in common. From plants to bacteria to people, every life form uses the same genetic material built from DNA, or its close chemical relative, RNA. This makes perfect sense to evolutionists who believe all life evolved from a common ancestor. But there is a more profound question still to be answered. If DNA is the spark of life, what or who created DNA? John Chaput, a chemist at Arizona State University, studies the roots of DNA, where it came from, and how it has survived long enough to produce complex life.
For all cells to survive, they require DNA, which is the genetic information or the blueprint for that organism. And for cells to live, they have to grow and divide, and during that process, that DNA has to be copied identically so that you maintain that genetic information from one cell to the next.
John is playing the role of an enzyme called DNA polymerase. His job is to copy the code of one DNA strand onto another.
A always base pairs with T, and C always base pairs with G.
But DNA can't replicate all by itself. It requires John, the polymerase, to do the copying. But at the first spark of life, there was no John. It's a big problem for the theory of evolution. DNA could not have been the first molecular basis for all of life because it can't copy itself. If not DNA, what was the first spark of life?
It's quite possible that DNA may be the product of evolution and that other genetic materials preceded it in the history of life.
DNA has a double helix structure, like this rope. A genetic material that came before it would have to have been able to bind with its complex shape in order to pass on genetic information. One candidate is RNA, a simpler form of DNA that is found in our cells today.
But yet, if we look at RNA, RNA is still very complicated, and it may have been preceded by an even simpler genetic material.
RNA is too complicated to be the very first genetic material because it's made of a complex sugar called ribose. Imagine you were a scientist 3.5 billion years ago, waiting for the first spark of life. In order for RNA to form, 5 specific sugar molecules would have to spontaneously come together one by one in a very particular order. Scientists think the odds of that happening in Earth's primordial swamp were highly improbable. You would be waiting for a very long time. But John thought there may be a genetic material made of a simpler sugar than ribose, something more likely to form on its own. By recreating evolution in a test tube, he may have found the perfect fit. A sugar that forms TNA. No, not that. TNA, or threose nucleic acid.
And threose is very exciting because it's chemically much simpler than ribose.
John thinks TNA is a likely candidate for being the first spark of life because it is made of 4 identical sugar molecules that come together in just one easy step.
And when you make a genetic polymer out of threose nucleic acid, it turns out that it base pairs very well with RNA. So it has the ability to not only be chemically simpler than RNA, but it can also exchange genetic information with RNA.
John may have found an ancestor of DNA, an ancient genetic blueprint that showed up long before the complex machinery that is in our cells today. He has not yet been able to show that TNA can copy itself, but he believes it is the best candidate so far to be the precursor to complex life.
So life is so complex that many people feel that it must have had a higher power, a godlike power that helped create life as we know it. But the reality is, when you take a look at it from the perspective of, say, chemistry, it's really a question of what molecules might have been present and how are these molecules able to react with one another.
Scientists are zeroing in on a molecule that may have been the first genetic material on Earth. Would this be the spark of life? Perhaps the answer is deeper than chemistry. What if the origin of life can be traced back to one simple pattern, a pattern that governs the structure of the entire universe?